The problem is if you focus your economy only on buying and selling, you're going to build a system which prioritises making money above everything else. And we have a very fragile economy which collapses if it stops.
The coronavirus pandemic continues to grow.
The economic pain of COVID-19 will be deep and protracted, and nowhere will be spared.
We've got desperate people turning up at the soup kitchen every day. Desperate people.
COVID is on the one hand showing us what we really need to live, and on the other hand showing us how fragile the economy is.
This is Simon. He's an ecological economist. Ecological economics takes a big picture view that sees the human economy as embedded in nature. It focuses on sustainability and development rather than efficiency and growth. I discovered Simon's article, What Will the World Be Like After Coronavirus? And reading it felt like a bit of a eureka moment. The article explained that the economics of collapse are fairly straightforward. Businesses exist to make a profit. If they can't produce, they can't sell things. This means they won't make profits, which means they are less able to employ you. So, more people lose their jobs or fear losing their jobs. As coronavirus set this collapse in motion, it revealed that our current economic system can't be relied upon to give us the things that we need to live, like healthcare, food, and housing.
And so you have to have some other system which steps in and protects those things.
One of the things that the pandemic has revealed is our reliance on growth. I wanted to talk with Simon more about this.
Across all kinds of environmental categories, never-ending growth is just a terrible idea.
Growth is one of our least contested ideologies. For one, it sounds like a good thing, and it's what we've been told we're aiming for, with gross domestic product seen by many as the measure of success. But you don't have to look far to find plenty of other people shouting otherwise. The growth is not only terrible for our planet, but mathematically impossible. Put simply, economic activity uses materials from the earth, turns them into energy and sells them. Sure, we're turning to renewables, but year on year we fly more, buy more, and there's more of us on the planet. So given that we have a finite amount of resources, even if we just continued at a sustained pace, we'd eventually completely undermine the natural systems that our economic system relies on. Add to that the mathematical paradox of sustained growth, year on year, and it's pretty clear that infinite growth is just a really bad idea.
So how do you manage an economy that doesn't grow? And how do you do it in a just and equitable way?
This is where alternative models like Kate Raworth's donor economics are changing the way we think about distribution. Kate believes we can manage an economy that doesn't rely on growth. But first we have to change how we think about work. As she explains, work happens in 4 spaces: the market, the state, the household, and the commons. More on those later, but critically, Kate explains that our current economic system is totally biased towards markets, and they're the basis of the capitalist system. The market mechanism is based on supply and demand, where goods are bought and sold at prices determined by what is known as the free market.
Essentially, the default position of a market is not how much do you need this service we're providing, it's are you willing to pay for it.
Simon explained that markets are very reliant on continual growth, which is a dynamic unique to markets. Restrictions in relation to the pandemic have stopped a lot of that growth, revealing that we can't get all the things that we need to live safe and healthy and enjoyable lives purely from market-based processes. The example he gave is that just because advertising campaigns can't be made and hair can't be cut because designers and hairdressers have to stay at home, it doesn't stop there being homes to live in or food to eat. But our reliance on market-based processes means that people are genuinely struggling to pay their rent or buy food. He also explained how our current system favours efficiency over resilience.
What capitalism is very good at is making each individual process as efficient as it possibly can be. When you scale it up to the whole system, you end up with no slack, there's no give, and therefore it's not resilient at all, it just kind of collapses.
The preventative measures in response to COVID-19 meant that many people couldn't go to work and the economy had to stop functioning as it usually would. Simon highlighted that in response to this, things like food, childcare, money, and shelter have been provided in different ways. This is where those other realms that Kate describes come into play. One realm is the household, where we see informal support within families and friendship groups, doing things like cooking, cleaning, and childcare. Another is the commons, where value is co-created in both the physical and digital world. Think of Wikipedia, for example. Through the pandemic, we're seeing non-hierarchical groups like soup kitchens and free food delivery services, which apply the principles of the commons to address the community's needs. The third realm is the state, which is one we're perhaps more familiar with. In the UK, we've seen the state stepping in to support citizens through things like the furlough scheme, covering people's wages.
What that really highlights for me is that there are different ways of doing kind of economic provisioning, which don't rely on the market, and because they don't rely on the market, we're able to prioritise different kinds of needs.
As well as different needs, we spoke about the fact that there are different kinds of value and different kinds of value creators too.
It's about coming to understand that entrepreneurs aren't the only value creators in our society.
Simon explained that things like volunteering or looking after your kids or working within the public sector can all be value-creating activities. And whilst we have some conception of this, at a certain point all that seems to go out the window and our economic system just prioritises financial value. The field of ecological economics recognises that there are so many other kinds of value. They could be emotional value, nutritional value, ecological value, as well as social value. And you can't possibly compress them all into one number.
So what that means is every productive decision essentially should be a political decision. It should be a decision that we argue about and we say, well, do we want to put resources into this, or should they go into that instead? What is it we actually as a society want to produce? But I think the idea of that really democratic process is in some ways quite scary.
The idea of democratic decision making means we would collectively determine the value of things. This is important if we're to reduce our over-reliance on markets and focus on the things we believe matter in life. But as Simon says, this idea is quite strange to us. So I've looked for some examples of what that might look like. Examples that are currently working, are more democratic, and move away from traditional market-based processes. Workers' cooperatives, which are especially strong in Brazil and Norway, allow employees to have a say over things like how profits are distributed, what products they stock, or which clients they work for. Another example is providing citizens with a universal basic income, a version of which is set to roll out in Spain soon. This monthly income would allow people to spend their time doing more things they deem meaningful but which may pay less or not at all, like running a local allotment, making art, or visiting the elderly in their community. Or there's participatory budgeting. This form of democratic decision-making gives citizens a say on how money is spent, which could be deciding between upgrading the library, rolling out free school dinners, or pedestrianising the high street. I've been getting super fired up about alternative economic models for a while now, but I wanted to know from Simon how we could get others on board.
For me, if we can use video or if we can use articles like you've written to show people that there are possible futures, but that we need to be active actors in those futures.
Which one do you think will happen? What do you think is most likely? And there's an element of which I think that's the wrong question. The one which is most likely is the one that we come together to try and build. What I hope to see is that people who are really engaging in mutual aid now, that they start to kind of become politicised and they start to see connections between the work they're doing as an individual and the broader economic and social systems.
Those connections between us as individuals and the broader systems aren't always easy to see. And I think that's the reason why so many of us switch off when we even hear the word economics. But Simon reassured me that real lasting change can take place if we combine two things: action and imagination.
The world of imagination, the world of the actions you're doing right now can't exist separately. We have to work to link them together.
So what does Simon mean by action? Action means engaging in different kinds of economic provisioning. That could be sewing workers' scrubs, looking after a neighbour's kids, doing pro bono work, or being part of a cooperative or volunteer group. Those things start to emphasise the aspects of the economy which don't need to grow forever. And what does he mean by imagination? Imagination means thinking about what different futures could look like. futures where our economy helps people to thrive and which celebrates rather than exploits our incredible planet. This kind of economy would also ensure we're safe and healthy and better equipped to deal with a pandemic like COVID-19.
There's this kind of idea that you can either have, the neoliberal economy of the US and the UK, or you can have Soviet-style socialism.
Yeah.
And I just feel like those can't be the only options. And what I want the conversation to be is about how do people come together and build those new futures and do so in a way which is just and fair.
Thanks for watching this video about alternative economic futures, and a huge thank you to Simon Mair for agreeing to be part of this conversation. It's really opened my eyes, and while this video has looked at economics from a macro scale, I'm really interested in looking at some of the more specific examples in future videos.
So I'm going to pass over to you two to just speak a little bit, and then we'll keep going. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Isabel, and thanks everyone. I hope you were able to watch, and I hope that you enjoyed, but I'll wait to hear from you in the Q&A. I'll just speak a little bit about, I guess, my background and what drove me to make this video, and then perhaps George can talk more about the making of the video. So I guess I've always been interested in the macro. I studied architecture, as Isabel said, and I realized I wasn't actually very good at the architectural scale, but I was very interested in problem solving, and I was very interested in things that were multidisciplinary. And I think those two things probably led to me being kind of passionate about making a video like this, and I hope it's the first of many. And I think a lot of the things that I read in Simon's article that I originally found struck a chord with me, because he takes a sort of non-siloed approach. So he talks about politics, he talks about how we assign value, he talks about meaningful employment, or what we class as employment. And all of these things for me aren't kind of one single discipline, which was refreshing, given that what my experience of economics had been was that it was sort of this dark art that those of you who haven't studied aren't allowed to have any say on, and it just works and it happens behind the scenes, and that's the way it is, and that's the way it's always going to be. And I guess maybe kind of cockily thought, well, that's not fair. And I want to understand this thing. And also, the more I unpacked it, the more I realized it's actually about storytelling, and it's actually about deciding what we assign value to. So for those reasons, when I read Simon's article, I thought, gosh, this guy is one of a few people who I've read or heard of saying things that are slightly different, but realizing actually it's not just individual people saying this. The alternative way of thinking is more mainstream than we like to think. And maybe we just have a role to play in disseminating that and making it more apparent that it isn't an alternative crazy few who are thinking like this. At the time, last year, we were in lockdown in a camper van in Spain, long story. But in a moment of blind faith, I basically reached out to Simon and said, would you like to make this video? And I don't know if he knew what he was signing up for, but he said yes. And we had an hour-long, or 2 hours conversation. Yeah, 2 hour-long conversation where we sort of unpacked the article, but also some of his other ideas and ideas of other economists. And I sort of thought, well, I'm going to use my skills at sort of macro thinking and strategy and storytelling, and I'm going to sort of piggyback off Simon's ideas in the true idea of collaboration. And this is what came out of it. So yeah, I'm really proud of what we've achieved, but I also think that this is just one tiny example of collaborating and using different skill sets to share a message. And I'd probably also add, before maybe we talk a little bit about how George kind of turned it into an animation, and how we had many conversations about language and making it accessible to non-economic thinkers, that the audience is probably not necessarily intended for people who are here at a WEAll seminar. It was really intended, I guess, for something that you could sort of show your granny. It was, how could we take these big concepts that seem to many of us like untacklable issues and explain them in very simple, tangible terms,
and very simple language, very simple graphics. So the idea is that it's shareable. The idea is that it's an introduction. It's not answering every question. It's reflecting on an article that Simon wrote, introducing some basic concepts, such as Kate Raworth's model, which is one of many kind of brilliant models. And we're going to talk a bit more about the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and the models that they're using. But yeah, so the sort of audience and the goal was make something that's digestible, that's 10-minute long, that uses our skills as storytellers and Simon's fantastic ideas. And that's sort of where it came from. But how would you want to talk a little bit about the kind of animation and how you bounce off me a little bit?
Well, yeah, I mean, this project was very much Bryony's baby. It started off in Bryony's head over months of reading books and articles and countless conversations over breakfast and long drives about the economics, and a lot of the time, like Bryony digesting information, it really being relevant to her, and then her really trying to explain it to me. I'm very much not an economic kind of person, but it really quickly sunk in that regardless of whether I understand the terminology or historical references or anything like that, the economics is for everyone, because no matter what we do, if you've got money in your bank or if you've got a mortgage or a car, or we're just involved in economics. So it is important for us all to understand economics to a certain level. So yeah, so this project kind of was, as Bryony was getting fired up about economics and the book Donut Economics, and then I think Simon's article was probably the tipping point where you kind of thought, right, okay, here's someone that I think we can interview and use the well of knowledge and then disseminate that. And even then, once we recorded this really long, interesting interview over Zoom, then came the point of editing it, and all of it would have been like relevant and interesting. It's just, as this is where the filmmaker part of it comes in. You've really got to try and get to the point quickly to make it accessible to people like me. So a lot of the time it was like Bryony had written out the script and edited, and then she'd read it to me, and I'd be like, okay, you've kind of lost me a bit there, and I'm the target audience, so let's try and change it. So eventually we managed to edit it down, because obviously it's such a complex subject, and then the use of visual aid, which was kind of, that was a mix between us. Bryony makes kind of like the still images with all the layers, and then I then spent all the time making it move, and hopefully keeping it interesting with the music, sound effects, and swishiness to try and keep it going. That's basically the process anyway.
Yeah, that's probably enough from us to whet your appetite, hopefully.
Yeah, no, it's really useful. Also, I like that, George, you were sort of the target audience. And I think your point is something that I know we all struggle with a lot, is WEAll as an organization struggles with, is what are the key messages? How do you distill the information? How do you take such complex, ideas and make them simple? So with that, I'm going to introduce Simon, who obviously you all saw in video. So he's an ecological economist trying to understand the current economy in order to build a better one. His research interests include the history of economic thought, utopian economics, and various kinds of models. Currently working in the ways labor and capital have been conceptualized in different theories of production, and where energy ought to enter into these theories. Stock flow consistent modeling of no growth economies, and exploring the economic potential of utopian fiction. Take it away. Sorry, I stumbled there.
Thank you very much. Hello everybody. So I should say I currently work as a lecturer at the University of Bradford. So that's where I'm calling from today, or just outside. I'll just say a little bit. I initially actually just want to say thank you very much to Bryony and George. Like, it's very, very flattered of them to thank me and say they're piggybacking. But I mean, if they were piggybacking on me, then I was very much piggybacking on people like Kate Raworth and all those other ideas. And like, and the work done by WEAll as well, I should say. And also it's really interesting watching that back and remembering that conversation. And I can't tell you how rambly and awkward some of that conversation was that they edited into a coherent narrative. So I think that was incredible. It's also really interesting watching it back, because the article that Brian referred to was written over the course of about a week, as lockdowns were kind of starting to really hit, and it was really me attempting to make sense of that process and the pandemic and what felt like the world kind of collapsing around me. And so and then I guess then we kind of recorded that a few months later, and now we're just over a year from when all this kicked off. And so it's kind of interesting to think, for me, to kind of reflect back and see how much of that I think is a kind of an accurate analysis, and how much and where my own thinking has changed. And I do think some of it holds. I think all the discussion around value and the kind of a general introduction to ecological economics is really it is still, I think, kind of true. This question, as Brian said very nicely, actually, this question of how we assign value and what that means is, for me, a really central question in terms of how we make sense of the economy for something like COVID, but also for things like climate change. And actually, I mean, I'd be interested to just hear everybody else's reflections, see where the conversation goes. But I'm kind of most interested actually to think about what the kind of strategic use of something like this is at this kind of moment, where perhaps in some ways I feel like perhaps this kind of moment of possibility and change that COVID at one point seemed to represent, it kind of feels like it might be slipping a little bit, and thinking about how we perhaps use this kind of thing to build and move forward. But I think that's all I'll say for now, and I can say more in the Q&A.
Thank you, Simon. I like that question actually a lot too, right? It seems like we had this perfect time. COVID was here. The fractures of the economy were so clear. Are we losing that opportunity? What does that look like? And then I'm very happy to introduce our last panelist today, Lukas, who is speaking on behalf of WEAll. And so he is a researcher in Wellbeing and post-growth economics, researching ways to transform our economic system towards one that prioritizes social justice and environmental integrity over economic growth. He's recently completed his PhD, in which he investigated how structural change in the economy can contribute to that goal. And he's now working with WEAll Scotland because he's passionate about putting such new economic models into practice by building a community for systems change. So thank you, Lukas, and I'll pass over to you just for a couple minutes.
Yeah, thank you for introducing me, and thank you for inviting me. I'm really honored to speak next to Simon and Brian and George. And I really enjoyed watching the movie, and I think it's yeah, you talked a lot about how the target audience is less people who don't know much about this. But I mean, I spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I still found it valuable and useful, and it triggered new thinking in me. So I think it's really well done, and really nice video. And I think I just want to quickly say maybe that one of the points I find quite nice about it, and speaking on behalf of WEAll, is it makes a really good, powerful case for what WEAll is doing, I think. And I think especially the points that stood out for me were when Simon were talking about how we kind of need these different democratic ways, new ways of assigning value if you're not relying on the market as much anymore, and how that can feel a bit scary. I think is actually a really interesting point that resonates with me. And so I think it really shows that it's not just an economic question, but that we also need to think about how do we build these new democratic institutions that can do this kind of thing, because I think our current systems are not very good at that. So it's really about, you need to break down this boundary that Brian also mentions between economics and everything else. I think it really it's not very helpful, and that's one of the things WEAll is trying to do. And the other thing is about how to connect the dots, or make people connect the dots between the individual actions and the individual lots of good examples that are happening on the ground that are in the video, like cooperatives, and how you kind of translate that into political change at a higher level. And I think this is kind of the way I see it. One of the core missions of WEAll is to bring together all the people, and lots of you in the room are probably part of that, because you are might be WEAll members. And it's like really kind of bringing together everybody and building that momentum and that kind of to actually achieve some of the higher level political changes. And to end on a note of maybe optimism, I think it's starting to work slowly. So we do see, like, I know a lot about Scotland, and for example, in the last manifesto of the SNP for the election this year, which is now in power, they promised a new act on community wealth building, for example, because there were practical examples of that in Scotland, and therefore also starting to do more to support social enterprises and these kind of things. So I think it's really, yeah, I think it's a really, really nice movie, and it really speaks to the things that WEAll is trying to do and get across.
Thank you, Lukas. So now, best part, we're going to open for a Q&A. So for those that are interested in asking questions, I would say either you can use the raise hand function, which you can do via the reactions, right? Like this. And if you don't want to, you may just write in the chat. So great, Jason, go ahead and unmute yourself. Please ask your question.
Yeah, apologies, my video is not working. Sorry if I lag out, my internet's being quite dodgy today. But yeah, I love the video, and I love all the ideas that's stemming out of it. I love the way you could like tell the story and that narrative, and I think it's really good at kind of portraying those ideas to audiences like myself who aren't necessarily kind of that knowledgeable on economics, but have some kind of interest in the way that economies are changing. I have a question around, have you got any thoughts on or ideas on how these models can actually be implemented in practice? So like donut economics, for example, I know is kind of being trialed in Amsterdam and probably a few other cities across the world as well. I think there's somewhere in the UK, I can't remember where. So like, have you got any ideas on how that can be implemented? And then if you look at the point made about looking at what actually adds value to the economy, and it's not just financial value, how does that then translate into people making a living using those economic models? Because the way things are set up at the moment is people who are quite high value adding in society might not necessarily get paid as much as someone who has a lot of investments or something like that. So it's like, how do those people then adopt that economic model and then make a living off the back of it?
Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say thanks, Jason. And just to confirm, was that directed at Simon? I missed the part at the beginning. I think it was for you, Simon. You can go for it, and then we'll just bolt on at the end, because you've probably got a brilliant answer to this.
Oh yeah, good. Yeah, really nice, easy question to start with. No, I mean it's a really important question, but it is really difficult. I think it's difficult on kind of multiple levels, actually. I mean, like even on a personal level, this question of how do you make a living in a way that embodies your kind of ideals and values if they conflict with the dominant system, right? And it's a question that I always grapple with myself, and I actually think this is perhaps just a way for me to try and dodge the question, but that's kind of part of the power and might of the capitalist economy, if you like, this kind of coercion and also kind of forcing you to choose between your ideals and the need to feed yourself and have kind of a socially acceptable standard of living is part of the reason it's so difficult and so kind of all encompassing. That said, and I would very much like Pauline to come in at some point with her kind of solutions, which would be wonderful. I actually think that you can implement these ideas, and they have, in a way, kind of fairly simple implications, I think, but they can sometimes be kind of counterintuitive. So I think it's about doing what you have to do to make a living, find a way to participate in the market, but perhaps try and do that in a way which allows you time and energy to do other more political things or engage with people in your workplace through kind of fairly traditional things like union organizing. Try and do things which shift that balance of power within a workplace or a community. That's not really a satisfying answer, but it's probably the best you're going to get from me. Maybe Pauline has a better one.
Yeah, I think it depends on the person's situation, and there's lots of different ways that it can be adopted. I guess like cities can adopt the model, businesses, which is the perspective I'm kind of looking at it from, can adopt the model, and I guess the more it's adopted and the more that then trickles down to more people, then maybe that's when you'll start seeing kind of like the result and the impact of adopting it.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, yeah, I should say there are possibilities there, right? Like, I mean, social enterprises are obviously really interesting. This idea of mission-led business and non-profits. I am, and while I'm sympathetic, I always have kind of a skepticism, I suppose, as to how well they'll be able to scale. But I do think there's something kind of promising and interesting there. Yeah.
I would maybe also add, Jason, just two things from me. One is, I think that Simon reminded me is when we talked, is that models and frameworks help us, but we don't have to adopt a single one. And I think that's what's kind of lovely for us floating around and just sort of reading and picking up ideas, is to say, this and this, actually, you're saying the same thing and there's a different phrase. And sometimes that's what we struggle with, is it doesn't seem like we have a unified front, but a lot of us are working towards the same goals with a slightly different framework and a slightly different model. And then my second point was in terms of how we kind of feed ourselves while also eroding the system. And I would say it's exactly that. It's eroding the system as opposed to completely overthrowing it, and dancing with that tension, even just as ourselves, as practitioners. Yes, okay, we take commercial work all the time, but we're also very clear that we do work for free because we believe in it. And we're very clear up front that we've done it for free. And these are the ways that people can help us. And I think sometimes it's just about clearly communicating that you're attempting to do that dance and that you're existing in one world because you have to, but also in another ideal future world. And that's something Eric Olin Wright talks about, eroding capitalism as opposed to overthrowing it or dismantling it. So that would be my two kind of additions to that, but I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, Pauline.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, we all will start with a basic income. And so we have a basis of money going around. And then you already see like crowdfunding, YouTubers and artists have a Patreon where they have like patrons or fans or followers that provide their monthly income. And it would be very less stressed if you have a basic income and Patreons. But here in the Netherlands, we also have now like a social enterprise where people are part-time entrepreneurs, but when the income is low, they get money from welfare, from the community, from the municipality. So that's all worked out financially, legally. So that works. And you have a company that does everything what you need to do as a business owner. You just do your job, what you want to do, and they take care of bookkeeping and regulations and pensions and whatever taxes. So there are all kind of in-between possibilities to make this transition.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. And I think there's a couple people putting some other resources in the chat. Lukas, do you have anything? Yeah, did you want to comment on anything?
Yeah, I think all of this very good contribution. I think maybe to say a bit about the first question that Jason mentions about how these models can be implemented. And I think it's very much related to the second question about how people make a living. And I think it's kind of really And I think we do see that happening. It's kind of trying them out and actually showing that they can make a difference, but then kind of trying to scale them up. And I think we see that, which is what I find quite encouraging, is like we see that with a lot of different ones. There is an appetite for these new economic models. There's donut economics. I think last year I talked at an event where they implemented at the city scale, and there were like councillors from 5 different cities, so like Amsterdam, and I think Oxford was there as well, where they're trying to do it at the city scale. Then in the more German-speaking region, there's the economy for the common good, which is now being implemented by, I think, quite a few town councils around the world. So as has been said before, like there are lots of different models. We don't have to choose one, and I think it's very encouraging that there are lots of reasons why they get chosen on one side or the other. But they are kind of being taken up, and hopefully that can then at some point lead to changes at a higher level, as for example in Scotland, as I already mentioned, we will see what that actually turns out to be, but we have an act to support community wealth building because Ayrshire Council has trying to do that, and that has kind of provided momentum and pressure on the Scottish government to do that. And I think in terms of people make a living, I think that's interesting to look at the macro perspective, and there's a lot of talk in the field about like kind of like what we call unearned income, or having a discussion about what are the things you're actually allowed to make what kind of money with, like, and that is especially now coming in COVID as it's like rents from landlords and property and other kind of things where you make money from just because you have some kind of privilege or you own something, or like intellectual property rights. And I think that has been rising up the agenda. I think in some way part of the solution will be to kind of distribute that, and that will take quite hard legislation, I think, in terms of restricting these kind of incomes, and that's not going to be easy to implement. Like, and I think until you have these kind of big system level changes, it's also going to be hard for social enterprises to pay a living wage if they work in a marketplace where they're kind of disadvantaged by being nice. So I think you kind of need these higher level changes.
Thank you, Lukas. Does anyone else have a question that they'd like to ask? I have Simon. I see you unmiking yourself, so I'm going to let you speak. Yeah, and I also have a question. But
well, it was sort of a reflection really on that, because I don't think it was Brian at the start talked about, or maybe it was George talked about the relationship between economics and politics, and then just hearing Lukas talk about these kind of macro level system changes. The thing which I always grapple with and struggle with implementation of these ideas is that politics aspect of it, is who, in a sense, who has the power now, and how does this threaten them or not? And so I'm kind of interested as to what the kind of political actions are to build support for some of these things. Like something like universal basic income, I think sounds like really promising, really interesting. But I wonder if we seriously thought that it would destabilize the system that we have in a meaningful way, would you be able to implement it, or would that just get shut down?
George just said, are you going to answer that?
Big question. Well, big theory.
Not that I've got the answers, it's just that I think that having a conversation is important, and I usually put my thing in because I'm not an economist, but I think I would add to that yes, it is a threat. It's a huge threat, and I think that's why we're not moving as fast as those of us who want to move forward are, and I think that's what kind of drains us. But it's important to engage with the opposition and talk to people at a local level who are voting differently than we are, or who are encouraging the existing paradigms to exist, even though to us we think, well, why are you allowing yourselves to be trapped by a system that isn't working for you yourself? I mean, in the UK, we can see it with so many of the things that we've recently voted on, that confusion as to why are we in a country full of people that have chosen something that we don't think that normal people would want. And so I think it's naive to think that it isn't a threat. I guess for me, it's just about, it goes back to storytelling, and it goes back to how frustrated, I feel often, that the ideas are there, it's just that they're not being told or shared in the right way, or they're just the means to share them aren't there yet. So I think so much of this is network building rather than proposing new ideas, and that's why sometimes these webinars we're all agreeing is because we're kind of bashing our heads together. We there's still things to nut out, but we've got the ideas and we're sort of working out how do we build the critical mass and how do we tell the story and how do we make this something that people talk about in the pub, in the school, waiting for the kids to come out of school, to their children. How do we make this a conversation that reaches more than the 20 of us sitting in that room, in this room? And I don't have the answer to that, but I do think that the more we have tangible examples of things working, the more we build that belief that that alternative works. And that's where I think the scaling up question is kind of, it's a stepping stone of, okay, these people are living in a cooperative, these people are time banking, these people are using an alternative currency, and all of them aren't competing, but actually these are all really good examples of a really practical application. But I totally agree with you, Simon. I think that it's a huge threat to the existing system, and I think it's totally about power. And because what we're sort of talking about is decentralized, it's very hard to make that work within the current system. And I don't know the kind of answer to that, other than I think that we should all be telling stories and we should all be talking to people who don't agree with us or who don't understand the idea that we're proposing. And it's a very painful process, but I do think we should be doing that more, and creating new media outlets, which are, again, not the usual suspects. That would be kind of my response to that. But I'm also very frustrated, and we are together. We talk about this quite a lot, that power is what's stopping these things from moving forward, really. And yes, that what Isabel's just shared is all about storytelling. That link is fantastic, and really beautiful graphics as well, which I think is a nice, fights the idea of economics being very academic and dry. The Stories project is really beautifully done.
I had a conversation with Stuart Wallace this morning, and the two things that he said are pretty much exactly like when I asked, why WEAll is different, or like he came out of retirement to continue to do this work. He said narratives and power bases. And those are his two things, which I think is interesting. Anyway, Neil, please feel free to ask your question. You'll have to unmute yourself before you begin speaking though, unfortunately.
I'm speaking from the West of Scotland. I'm involved in the resilience group here through the COVID period, and there's a few of us got very interested in donut economics as a way out of this. And in fact, I've got a meeting with the council next week to try and convince them it's a good idea. The problem I have in Argyll, where I live, there is about 50 or 60 different communities that are, as you were saying earlier on, doing lots of sustainable things and working to reduce their carbon emissions and all the rest of it, but they're very much working in isolation. And that's why my view is that the donut economic model, I mean, the sort of thing we haven't really talked about here is that it's the kind of monitoring our the various ceilings that Kate Rayworth comes up with, the social and the environmental stuff, and I see that very much as a framework. And as somebody said earlier on, that everywhere else will have different issues that will build into that framework. But if you don't have a framework to gather all these disparate little things together, you're always going to continue on doing your own thing, and you're not coming together in a concerted direction. And that's the big thing that frustrates me very much, having been working with communities. And I'm an environmental consultant, and I've been working with communities for about 30 odd years. And yeah, I mean, amazing people, always amazing people, but some of them won't speak to the town down the road because they've fallen out or whatever. We need to come together, and we need a framework to come together under. That's really where I see donut economics, but it is a challenge, and it needs supporting from, I think, a regional and national level. And the other big final thing I'll say is in terms of GDP that Kate highlights in her book. The key, we have to convince the policymakers that you've got to move away from GDP. Otherwise, all of what we're doing is really a waste of time. We could all be working away and beavering away in our little areas, but if the powers that be are continuing on a growth model, then it's, where are we going? So that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, those are very important questions, particularly around the framework for coming together. I think it's a very that is it. Simon, Bryony, George, Lukas, any comment? Go ahead, Simon.
I think it all sounds. I don't know whether to say great or interesting, but there's a lot to think about there. But the thing that kind of really strikes me, though, is maybe it's a question back to you, Neil. But what is it about donut economics you think that would allow you to bring people together under it? Do you see something particularly kind of that people can connect with there? Is this about storytelling, or is it something else in your view?
Well, I'm a scientist by background, and I guess you've got to, and also as a consultant, you've got to be able to evaluate how you're getting on. So you do need to have, and donut economics is an onerous thing in that, a lot of the data gathering isn't really developed yet, as far as I can understand. But it gives you a framework, and if you don't have the answers, you can still identify that we need to put money into developing the research or whatever to find those answers. But if you don't have a framework that is actually guiding you in a certain direction, that opportunity and that money and research and development won't happen. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, that it draws people together and they can identify that we're going in a common direction, really. There's other models, I guess, but the problem with too many models is that, again, you muddy the waters, and you've got to really come and choose one, which, in my view, donut economics, choose it and run with it. And that's what I'd like to do here. And as I said, I'm meeting with the council who have a Building Back Better plan, which nobody as yet has seen. And I'm trying to get them to take this on as a framework that will then percolate down to everybody in the region. They're wanting to come from exactly the opposite direction, and how a community action plan is going to build donut economics. So there's a bit of a discord there, really, before we even meet, I think. So it's going to be quite interesting.
Simon, very quick response, because I want to make sure that we are good for time. And I know, Kim, you have a comment or question. Maybe actually, so she's asked it in the chat, if you think donut economics or similar ideas are catching on with other economists like yourself. So maybe you can couple those together.
Sure. Well, I guess, Neil, I wish you good luck. I just would be... I think one of the weaknesses of donut economics, framework I like, is that it doesn't really have a good handle on the kind of the politics of its situation, of how do you... it tends to frame things in a fairly technical way. It kind of says, we've got this new model, and if we implement it, it will work. And I think to that extent, it kind of underplays the politics of, like you said, like different communities disagree about things. And I actually think that's kind of fine, but you kind of have to work with it to implement your thing, your framework. Does donut economics similar ideas catch on with other economists like myself? yes, it's catching up with other economists like myself, but then
Simon's a special flavour economist. We should add.
I was once in a room with economists who thanked me for bringing a non-economist's view to the room. So it depends who you talk to as to whether or not I'm an economist and whether or not donut economics makes sense.
Brutal that happened to you. Yeah. Interestingly, so yeah, go ahead, Lukas.
Quickly say something about that. I do think that I have seen, like, especially in ecological economics, that donut economics, maybe not the whole thing, but definitely the image of the donut as a kind of goal has hugely taken off. Like, there's lots of people research in that area happening now, which is framed in that way of trying to get within the donut. And I think it's quite a powerful image. So I think that has definitely happened.
And Bryony and George, any comments before we close here?
Maybe just like finally the thing that Simon mentioned about that tension of the communities, it being okay that they disagree. I think I would kind of second that. I think we're so stuck in a mindset that we think partially in the existing economic models mindset, even beyond economics. And I think that is what we're kind of constantly grappling with, is we're trying to, and it comes down to utopias and painting futures, is we're trying to imagine a future that we can't picture because we're still trying to old colonial scientific section by section mindset onto it of everyone has to agree, everyone has to sign up to the same goal. So my lasting comment would sort of be, I think a lot of us are working towards the same thing. And yes, we sometimes have to play ball by the system that we exist within. And if that means creating metrics, then sometimes so be it. But I think messiness is good. I think messiness is a human quality. And disagreeing and sort of it being clumsy, I think probably should be the end goal rather than having one clear thing that we're all aiming for. And we do hope to make more videos. So if you're interested in sort of making a video with us, or you have a tangible example of people implementing some of these ideas in real ways, we're really interested for you to get in touch with us. But I guess I would just say thank you for sort of fighting the good fight, but don't worry if it seems like we're all not completely on the same page or with the same framework, because I think over time of speaking to people like Simon, that's what I'm realizing, is it's not about picking and choosing, it's about working within the system that be, but imagining a future that might be completely different from the one we have now.
Thank you, Bryony. That was beautifully said. Yes, agree. WEAll actually doesn't even have a framework because there's so many good ones and you can't pick and choose, and it depends on the community and all these things. Thank you all, Simon, Bryony, George, Lukas, for joining us, and all of you lovely participants. This is recorded, so hopefully you could share with your friends. And we hope to see you all soon engaging with the content that we're trying to throw out there in the world. And thank you, as Bryony said, for fighting the good fight. Have a lovely day, evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.